Blood-red clouds stretched across the Montana sky as Valerie Reed clutched her youngest child to her chest. 7 pairs of hungry eyes staring up at her with a hope she wasn't sure she could fulfill. The abandoned barn loomed before them like salvation and prison all at once, its weathered boards promising shelter but little else as the winter of 1878 tightened its grip around the frontier town of Pinecrest. Valerie's husband, Thomas, had been dead for 3 weeks now, taken by the same fever that had ravaged half the mining settlement. With the banker foreclosing on their modest home and no family to turn to, she had loaded her children and what possessions she could salvage onto their old wagon and headed south, hoping to reach her cousin in Colorado before the worst of winter set in. But fate had other plans when their wagon wheel shattered on the rocky trail, forcing them to seek refuge in this forgotten barn on the outskirts of a ranch, whose main house stood dark and silent half a mile away. "Mama, I'm cold," whispered 5-year-old Matthew, his small body shivering despite being sandwiched between his older siblings. "I know, sweetheart," Valerie soothed, arranging the threadbare blankets around the huddled forms of her children. At 32, she had faced more hardship than most, but nothing had prepared her for this alone with 7 children aged between 3 and 16, no money, and winter bearing down upon them like a predator. "We'll find some way to build a fire tomorrow," she promised, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. The barn was old but dry, and the hay in the loft would provide some insulation, but without a proper heat source, the bitter Montana nights would be unbearable. 16-year-old Mary, the eldest, caught her mother's eye with a knowing look. They both understood the gravity of their situation, though neither would voice it in front of the younger children. Their food would last 3 days at most, and while the nearby creek provided water, Valerie knew that exposure was just as deadly as starvation. As the children finally drifted into uneasy sleep, Valerie remained awake, staring through a gap in the barn's wall at the vast, star-filled sky. Somewhere in that expanse was Thomas, watching over them, or perhaps not. Perhaps the universe was as indifferent to their suffering as the town banker had been when he'd given her 24 hours to vacate her home. The sound of hoofbeats startled her from her bitter reverie. Panic seized her chest as she scrambled to her feet, searching frantically for anything to use as a weapon. Finding only a pitchfork with 2 broken tines, she positioned herself between the barn door and her sleeping children. The door creaked open, sending a shaft of moonlight across the dirt floor. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the night, the brim of a cowboy hat visible even in the darkness. "Who's there?" The man's voice was deep, carrying a note of surprise rather than threat. Valerie gripped the pitchfork tighter. "We mean no harm. My children and I needed shelter for the night. We'll be gone by morning." The man stepped forward, and moonlight revealed a face weathered by sun and wind, but with eyes that held no malice. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, his dark hair visible beneath his hat, stubble covering a strong jaw. "Madam, you're trespassing on my property," he said, but there was no anger in his tone. His eyes scanned the barn, taking in the sleeping children, the meager belongings, the broken-down wagon visible through the open door. "But I reckon you've got your reasons." "Our wagon broke down," Valerie explained, still not lowering her makeshift weapon. "My husband is." "We're heading to Colorado." Understanding dawned in the man's eyes. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair with a streak of premature silver at the temple. "Xavier Quincy," he introduced himself. "This is my ranch, and I'm not in the habit of turning away women and children on cold nights." He glanced at the pitiful bundle of kindling Valerie had gathered, clearly intending to attempt a fire come morning. Without another word, he moved to a corner of the barn where firewood was stacked, gathering an armful. "You were planning to light a fire in here?" he asked, a hint of alarm in his voice. "We needed the warmth," Valerie defended. "I was going to be careful." Xavier shook his head. "This old barn would go up like tinder, one spark on this dry hay, and—" He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he moved to the center of the barn where a stone pit had been built, likely for the previous owners to warm the space during calving season. "This is where you build a fire in here, nowhere else," he instructed, arranging the wood with practiced hands. From his pocket, he produced a tinderbox and soon had a small flame dancing among the kindling. As the fire grew, its warm glow spread across the barn, illuminating the faces of Valerie's children, who had begun to stir at the sound of voices. "Who are you, sir?" asked Mary, sitting up and protectively gathering her younger siblings closer. "Xavier Quincy, this is my ranch you found yourselves on." "I'm sorry for the intrusion, Mr. Quincy," Valerie said, finally lowering the pitchfork. "I'm Valerie Reed, and these are my children, Mary, James, Sarah, William, Emma, Matthew, and little Daniel." Xavier nodded to each child as they were named, his expression softening when little Daniel, not quite 4, peered at him with wide, curious eyes. "You all look half-starved," Xavier observed, his gaze returning to Valerie. "How long since you've had a proper meal?" pride warred with necessity in Valerie's heart. She was not accustomed to charity, having always managed to provide for her family even in the lean years of Thomas's illness. But looking at her children's hollow cheeks, she knew this was no time for pride. "We've been making do with what we have," she answered diplomatically. Xavier seemed to understand the unspoken admission. "I'll be back," he said simply, replacing his hat and heading for the door. "Is he going to make us leave, Mama?" asked 7-year-old Emma, her small face pinched with worry. "I don't think so, sweetheart," Valerie replied, though uncertainty gnawed at her. They had nowhere else to go if he did. True to his word, Xavier returned within the hour, leading a horse pulling a small cart laden with supplies. A large pot of stew steamed in the cool night air, alongside a sack of what appeared to be cornbread and several blankets. "It's not much," he said gruffly, clearly uncomfortable with the gratitude shining in 7 small faces. "But it'll keep you warm tonight." As Valerie helped distribute food to her eager children, she studied their unexpected benefactor. Xavier Quincy was not what she'd expected in a rancher. His clothes, while practical, were of good quality. His manner of speech suggested education beyond what most frontier men received. Yet there was something solitary about him, a guarded quality that spoke of a man accustomed to his own company. "Thank you," she said quietly when the children were occupied with their food. Not many would show such kindness to strangers. Xavier shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Got plenty of space. No sense in letting folks go cold when I've got fire and food to spare." "Still, it's more than most would do." He looked away, gazing into the fire. "Lost my wife and son to fever 5 years back, wagon train to Oregon. I know what it is to be alone with no help coming." The simple statement held volumes of unspoken pain, and Valerie felt a connection to this stranger that transcended their brief acquaintance. They were both intimately acquainted with loss, with the cruel indifference of fate. "I'm sorry," she offered, knowing the words were inadequate. Xavier nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without inviting further discussion. "You planning to continue to Colorado once your wagon's fixed?" "That was the plan. My cousin has a boarding house in Denver. She offered me work and a place for us to stay." "That wheel won't be fixed easily," Xavier observed. "Axle's damaged too, would take a proper wheelwright, and the nearest one's in Blackwater, 20 miles south." Valerie's heart sank. They had no money for such repairs. Xavier seemed to read her thoughts. "Winter's coming on fast. Passes will be snowed in within weeks. Not safe to travel with young ones." "We can't stay in your barn all winter, Mr. Quincy," Valerie said, though the prospect of continuing their journey filled her with dread. "No, you can't," he agreed. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "But my house has room. Used to be the ranch foreman's quarters before I bought the place. 4 bedrooms, only using one myself." The offer was so unexpected that Valerie could only stare at him. "Would be good for the house to have some life in it again," Xavier continued, his eyes fixed on the fire rather than meeting her gaze. "And I could use help around the place. My usual hands have gone south for winter, just keeping a skeleton crew of 3 men now." Pride made Valerie want to refuse, but reality demanded otherwise. "We would work for our keep," she said firmly. "I won't accept charity." "Fair enough," Xavier agreed. "Plenty of work to go around on a ranch this size. Even the little ones can help with something." And so it was decided, with a simplicity that belied the significance of the arrangement. By morning's light, Xavier had brought his wagon to transport their belongings to the main house, a sturdy two-story structure built of local pine and river stone. It wasn't grand, but it was solid and warm, with a large kitchen and ample room for Valerie's brood. The children, initially shy around their taciturn host, quickly adapted to their new surroundings. Mary and 13-year-old James took to helping with indoor tasks, while 11-year-old Sarah discovered a talent for cooking that impressed even Xavier. The younger ones were assigned simple chores, gathering eggs, feeding the chickens, sorting beans, all under Valerie's watchful eye. As November deepened into December, the ranch settled into a rhythm that became increasingly comfortable. Xavier, initially awkward around the children, gradually relaxed in their presence. Valerie would catch him explaining the workings of a saddle to fascinated William, or patiently showing Matthew how to whittle a simple toy from wood. With the first heavy snowfall, the ranch became isolated from the nearest town. Xavier assured them they had ample supplies to last the winter, and Valerie found herself strangely relieved by their enforced seclusion. Here, away from judging eyes and whispered gossip, her children could simply be children again, unburdened by the weight of their father's death and their precarious circumstances. One evening, after the younger children had been tucked into bed, Valerie found Xavier sitting alone on the porch despite the cold, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. "You'll catch your death out here," she admonished, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she joined him. "Been sitting on this porch in worse weather for 5 years," he replied. "Figure I'm either immune or too stubborn to die." The statement was delivered with such dry humor that Valerie couldn't help but laugh, a sound that seemed to surprise them both. "Your children are settling in well," Xavier observed after a moment. "They are. They've been through so much this past year. Thomas, my husband, was ill for a long time before he passed. The children had to grow up too quickly, especially Mary and James." Xavier nodded. "They're good kids." "Well raised." The simple compliment warmed Valerie more than it should have. "What about you? You mentioned you lost your family. Do you have any other relations?" "None that claim me," Xavier said, his tone matter of fact rather than self-pitying. "My father was not what you'd call a well-liked man. When he died, what few family connections we had dried up pretty quick. So you've been alone all this time?" "Got used to it," he shrugged. "Ranch keeps me busy enough not to notice most days." But Valerie sensed the loneliness beneath his pragmatic words. A man like Xavier Quincy hadn't built this ranch large enough to require seasonal hands and a foreman's quarters just to be busy. He'd built a life meant to be shared. As December progressed, Christmas loomed on the horizon, and Valerie faced the prospect of the holiday with mixed emotions. It would be their first Christmas without Thomas, and while she wanted to maintain some semblance of tradition for the children's sake, their resources were limited. Xavier, observing her concern, approached her one evening after the children were asleep. "Got business in town tomorrow," he said. "Need to pick up some supplies before the next storm hits. Anything particular you folks need?" Valerie hesitated. "The children are hoping for some small Christmas celebration. Nothing elaborate, just something to mark the day." Xavier considered this. "Reckon I could find some things in town might brighten up the place. Been a while since this house saw a proper Christmas." 2 days later, Xavier returned from town with his wagon loaded with not only the expected supplies, but also packages wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, which he secreted away in his study. When Valerie questioned him, he merely shrugged and said, "Christmas is for children." On Christmas Eve, after the younger children had been persuaded to go to bed with promises that morning would come faster if they slept, Valerie found Xavier in his study, awkwardly wrapping a wooden toy horse. "May I help?" she offered, unable to suppress a smile at the sight of his large, calloused hands struggling with the delicate task. "Obliged if you would," he admitted. "Never was much good at this sort of thing." Together, they wrapped the remaining gifts, simple but thoughtful items for each child. A hair ribbon for Mary, a pocket knife for James, a small cookbooks for Sarah, a wooden flute for William, a rag doll for Emma, a set of carved animals for Matthew, and a soft knitted blanket for baby Daniel. How did you know what each would like? Valerie asked, touched by the consideration behind each gift. Been watching, Xavier said simply. Folks tell you what they want if you pay attention. The statement struck Valerie with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had paid such close attention to her children to her? Thomas had been a good man and a loving father, but in the years of his illness, it had been Valerie attending to everyone else's needs with little thought to her own. There's something for you too, Xavier added, almost shyly, producing a small package from his desk drawer. Nothing fancy. Just saw it and thought you might like it. Surprised, Valerie accepted the package. Inside was a small silver locket on a delicate chain. The workmanship was exquisite, with a subtle floral pattern etched into the metal. Xavier, I can't accept this, she protested, though her fingers traced the pattern with appreciation. It's too much. It's not much at all, he countered. Just a small thing, thought you might like something that was just for you, not for being a mother or keeping house or any of that, just for you. The thoughtfulness behind the gesture moved Valerie more than the gift itself. When had anyone last seen her as simply Valerie, not as a wife or mother or widow? Thank you, she said softly. I have something for you too, though it's not nearly as fine. From her pocket, she produced a handkerchief she had embroidered with his initials. It was a simple gift, but she had worked on it late at night after the children were asleep, wanting to offer some small token of appreciation for all he had done for them. Xavier accepted it with evident surprise. Been a long time since anyone made something for me, he admitted, running his thumb over the neat stitches. Their eyes met across the study, and Valerie was suddenly acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of the fire on her skin, of the unexpected intimacy of exchanging gifts in the quiet house. The moment was broken by a small voice from the doorway. Mama, I had a bad dream. It was Matthew, clutching his blanket and looking small and vulnerable in his nightshirt. I'll be right there, sweetheart, Valerie assured him, grateful for the interruption that had prevented her from doing something foolish like wondering how it would feel to be held in Xavier Quincy's strong arms. Christmas Day dawned bright and cold, with sunlight sparkling off the snow-covered landscape. The children's delight at finding gifts by the fireplace filled the house with laughter and excitement that even Xavier couldn't resist. Valerie caught him smiling a rare, full smile that transformed his usually serious face as little Daniel toddled around proudly clutching his new blanket. The day passed in a haze of happiness that felt almost surreal after the hardships of recent months. Xavier had procured a small turkey from a neighboring ranch, and Sarah outdid herself preparing a feast that, while simple, was the most abundant meal they'd had since leaving their home. As January settled over the ranch with bitter cold and howling winds, life inside the house grew increasingly warm and comfortable. Xavier, initially so reserved, now joined them for meals without prompting, and even began to share stories from his younger days, tales of cattle drives and frontier adventures that enthralled the children. Valerie found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, noticing things she had been too preoccupied to see before. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, how gentle his hands could be when helping little Daniel up after a tumble. The deep rumble of his rare laughter when James told a particularly amusing story. One afternoon, while the older children were occupied with their chores and the younger ones napped, Valerie found Xavier in the barn, repairing a section of wall that had been damaged in the last storm. Need any help? She offered, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold. Could use an extra hand holding these boards, he admitted, and they worked together in companionable silence for a time. Can I ask you something, Xavier? Valerie finally said, gathering her courage. Anything. Why did you really let us stay? You could have sent us to town or helped us continue our journey before the snow came. Why take in 8 strangers? Xavier was quiet for so long that Valerie thought he might not answer. Finally, he set down his hammer and turned to face her. When I found you in that barn, he began slowly, with those children huddled around you trying to keep a brave face despite being cold and hungry, it reminded me of something my mother once told me. She said that a man is measured not by what he has, but by what he gives when giving is needed. He picked up a nail, turning it over in his fingers. I've been blessed with plenty. This land, this house, more than I need for one man, seemed wrong to let a family suffer when I had the means to help. Most men wouldn't see it that way, Valerie observed. Most men haven't been where I've been, Xavier replied. Haven't lost what I've lost makes a man see things different. And now, Valerie pressed, it's been nearly 2 months. We've long outstayed any reasonable hospitality. Xavier met her gaze directly. Now I can't imagine this place without you all in it. The simple honesty of his statement took Valerie's breath away. There was no pretense in his words, no hidden agenda, just a man acknowledging a truth that had crept up on him as surely as it had on her. The children adore you, she said softly. And I've grown fond of them, he admitted. Even little Matthew with his endless questions and Daniel with his habit of hiding my hat. They both laughed, the tension easing between them. And what about their mother? Valerie asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Have you grown fond of her too? Xavier's expression grew serious. You know I have, Valerie, more than is probably wise, considering you're planning to leave come spring. The reminder of their temporary arrangement struck Valerie with unexpected force. She had become so comfortable in this house, with this man, that she'd almost forgotten their stay was meant to be impermanent. What if we didn't leave? The words escaped before she could reconsider them. Xavier's eyes widened slightly. What are you saying? I'm saying that my children are happy here. They're safe, well-fed, and for the first time since Thomas died, they're not afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Valerie took a deep breath. And I'm happy here too. Happier than I expected to be again. This ranch is isolated, Xavier warned. Town's a day's ride, no school nearby, hard life for a family. We've known harder, Valerie countered, and being together all of us makes the hardships easier to bear. Xavier stepped closer, close enough that Valerie could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Valerie, are you sure? I'm not a man who speaks his feelings easily, but these past months with you and the children, they've brought life back to this place, back to me. I'm sure, Valerie whispered. More sure than I've been about anything in a long time. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Xavier raised his hand to her cheek. His touch was gentle, reverent almost, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. I never thought I'd find this again, he confessed. After Clara and my boy died, I figured that part of my life was over. I thought the same after Thomas, Valerie admitted. It feels almost disloyal to be happy again. Xavier shook his head. A good man wouldn't want you to mourn forever. Would want you to find happiness again. Clara would want the same for you, Valerie assured him. Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle exploration rather than a passionate embrace. Yet in its tenderness was a promise that neither took lightly a commitment to building something new from the ashes of what they had lost. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. The children, he began, they already love you, Valerie assured him. Even Mary, who misses her father terribly, has come to trust you. I'd never try to replace him, Xavier vowed, but I'd like to be a father to them in my own way, to give them the security they deserve. The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Valerie's eyes. I think they'd like that very much. That evening, after the younger children were asleep, Valerie and Xavier sat down with Mary, James, and Sarah to discuss the possibility of making their stay permanent. The 3 oldest children exchanged glances that suggested they had already discussed this possibility among themselves. Would you marry Mama? Mary asked directly, her practical nature asserting itself. Xavier, taken aback by her forthrightness, nodded. With your blessing, yes, I would ask her to be my wife, and we would stay here, all of us, James clarified. This would be your home, Xavier confirmed. I know it's not what you're used to, it's better, Sarah interrupted. Papa would want us to be happy. And Mama smiles more here than she has since he got sick. Valerie felt tears threatening again at her children's perceptiveness. They had seen her happiness even before she had fully acknowledged it herself. Mary, always the most protective of her siblings, fixed Xavier with a solemn gaze. "Do you love her, really love her, because she deserves that?" "Mary," Valerie admonished, embarrassed by her daughter's directness, but Xavier held up a hand. "It's a fair question." He turned to Mary. "Yes, I love your mother. Not just because she's kind or beautiful or the best cook this ranch has ever seen." This earned a small smile from Valerie. "I love her for her strength, for how fiercely she protects all of you, for how she faced everything life threw at her and didn't break." His sincerity seemed to satisfy Mary, who nodded once, decisively. "Then we're staying." The following Sunday, despite the snow that still blanketed the countryside, Xavier hitched the horses to his largest sleigh, and the entire family made the journey to town. The local preacher, a kindly older man named Reverend Johnston, was surprised but pleased to perform a small ceremony in the town's modest church. Valerie wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes with the silver locket Xavier had given her for Christmas around her neck. The children, scrubbed clean and dressed in their finest clothes, stood witness as their mother promised herself to a man who had once been a stranger but was now the center of their new life. "I never expected to find love again," Valerie admitted in her vows, her voice clear and sure. "But you showed me that the heart has room for new joy, even after great loss. You gave my children shelter when we had nowhere to turn, but more importantly, you gave us hope." Xavier, unused to public speaking, nevertheless found the words he needed. "When I found you in that barn, trying to keep your children warm, I thought I was just doing what any decent man would do. I didn't know I was finding my future. You and these children have brought laughter back to my house and purpose back to my days. I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to face the cold alone again." As they exchanged simple gold bands, Valerie looked at the faces of her children, from Mary's teary smile to little Daniel's confused but happy grin, and knew that what had begun as desperate necessity had transformed into something precious and rare. A second chance at happiness. That night, after returning to the ranch, their ranch now, truly, and putting the excited but exhausted children to bed, Valerie and Xavier stood on the porch where they had shared so many conversations over the winter months. "Are you happy, Mrs. Quincy?" Xavier asked, his arm around her waist as they gazed at the star-filled sky. "More than I thought possible," Valerie answered honestly. "When that wagon wheel broke and we took shelter in your barn, I thought it was the worst luck. Now I know it was the best thing that could have happened to us." Xavier pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "To think I almost didn't check the barn that night, was heading straight to the house after checking the south pasture. Something made me stop." "Fate," Valerie suggested with a smile, "or a guardian angel," Xavier countered. "Either way, I'm grateful." As they stood together in the crisp night air, Valerie reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the desperate mother sheltering her 7 children in a cold barn to becoming the wife of a man whose quiet strength had become her anchor. Life had taken so much from both of them, but in doing so had cleared the way for them to find each other. Inside the house, a fire burned warmly in the hearth, holding back the winter chill. It was the same fire Xavier had lit on that first night, a fire that had never been allowed to go out since, becoming a symbol of the warmth and life he had brought back to a family that had been on the brink of despair. "Come inside, wife," Xavier said softly, taking her hand. "It's too cold out here, and we have a lifetime of warm nights ahead." Hand in hand, they returned to the house that was no longer just a shelter, but a home filled with the laughter of children and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to hope for just a few short months ago. And as spring finally came to the Montana hills, bringing new life to the land, Valerie knew that the broken wagon wheel had not been a disaster, but a blessing that had led them exactly where they were meant to be, in a home where the fire would always burn bright, keeping the darkness at bay.